Australia's inland rivers rise in the north, flow through the Channel Country and flood out through the nation's deserts to only rarely reach their destination, Lake Eyre. The cradle of these rivers, the Lake Eyre Basin, is a land of extremes, of flood when the land is revitalised and natural drought when much of the basin dies. A boom-bust cycle that makes inland Australia different from the rest of the world. The wild rivers of the Lake Eyre Basin run free and are still in good ecological order. A series of threats during the 90s, including the plan to irrigate cotton on Cooper's Creek, saw the people of these river systems come together and forge what was to become known as the Lake Eyre Basin process. The process ignored state borders and put a sustainable economic, ecological and social future before politics and parochialism. Touted as the first of its kind in the world, it put the decisions on natural resource management in the hands of the people who lived in the basin, working closely with some of Australia's leading scientists. But in the first decade of the 21st century, this community-owned, basin-wide process has been threatened by a change in government funding practice. A river system that only 5 years ago was considered safe is once again seen by many as in danger. This is the story of the Lake Eyre Basin process.
And the people in the basin just decided that the government shouldn't be telling them what to do. We should be telling the government what we really want done with this piece of the country. It's a fairly large piece of the country. And not everyone agrees on what should be done with it either.
It's about the community being involved in the management of their own natural resources, and it's being involved in those natural resources right across the catchments and across the basin.
We all have a passion for where we live and what we do. And I think that when you have that passion, it should be captured and it should be utilised, because I think really only good things can come from that.
Well, I think the Lake Eyre Basin is absolutely critical to Australia. It's a basin the same size of the Murray-Darling, where we haven't made any of the mistakes that we've yet made in the Murray-Darling.
I think there's always going to be a threat that a community process that works with government can be held to ransom by government if it's relying upon government funding. Of course, I mean, that's a given.
The Lake Eyre Basin is a great example of why state boundaries make a nonsense of the whole process. That you can't manage a system like this, which spans 2-3 states and the Northern Territory, covers a vast area. You've got no hope of doing it if you're going to split it up into state boundaries or local council boundaries, for that matter, as well.
It's nature at its best, and it's taken thousands of years to develop the way it is now, and any significant change to that system, it won't cope. It wouldn't be able to cope.
There's nowhere else that I've seen in the country where there is such a coherent partnership working towards natural resource management on such a big scale. And it really is tackling the major issues. And to me, that's the only way that we're ever going to get close to solving the big problems in natural resource management in Australia. And the Lake Eyre Basin Coordinating Group, I think, offers that.
The rivers of the Lake Eyre Basin are the vestigial remains of Australia's inland sea and some of the world's last wild rivers. To date, there's been very little exploitation of these rivers, a minimum of irrigation. But it nearly wasn't so.
A group of cotton farmers today announced plans to set up a large irrigation project near the far western Queensland town of Windora.
This was a consortium of New South Wales cotton growers decided that they'd like to run a cotton growing enterprise on the Cooper.
The growers told a meeting in Windora that irrigation water will be obtained from the large Currareva waterhole under existing but unused irrigation licences. Pastoralists listened to the cotton growers' proposals and immediately moved to block them.
Cooper's Creek Protection Group was formed the very same afternoon that the Currareva cotton proposal was announced to the township of Windora.
The Lake Eyre Basin Steering Group, formed in Birdsville in 1995, is also opposing the cotton venture.
I think often in Australia we just have a knee-jerk response to something. We don't actually plan out. We don't say, 20 years, 50 years, how do we want this industry to be, or how do we want this community to be?
The Curra River Consortium were quite amazed, I think, that the locals would be so almost unanimously antagonistic to a proposal to grow cotton there. I'm quite sure they failed to estimate the strength of opposition to that proposal.
Channel Country cattle producers say they are joining forces with scientists and conservationists to keep irrigated farming out of one of Australia's last relatively unexploited river systems.
The Lake Eyre Basin is much more than a picture postcard view of one of the world's largest salt lakes. The basin covers a huge mosaic of bioregions and landforms of 1/6 of the Australian continent.
For a geographer, the Lake Eyre Basin is a line on the map which encompasses a drainage basin. It's an internally draining basin, or an endorheic basin as we call them, meaning that it doesn't drain to the sea, so it's quite an unusual basin in the world, in fact. When the rivers run, they tend to drain into Lake Eyre or even into the Simpson Desert.
The Lake Eyre Basin covers large chunks of Queensland and South Australia and includes parts of the Northern Territory and New South Wales. A vast area, a great body of a landscape that is kept alive by an intricate threading of water collection and distribution capillaries. The community of the Lake Eyre Basin found its voice and learnt that it could roar during the 90s, and what is known as the Lake Eyre Basin process came into being.
The fact that we're crossing political borders is really important and makes it special. The fact that it was designed by the participants is important. We see lots of different catchment management processes around Australia, but often they're ones that have been designed by the government, and in fact sometimes the people who sit on those committees are appointed by the ministers. It's nothing like that, this process. It's very much community owned. So that makes it distinctive as well. I mean, we're talking about a huge area of land, enormous. And when we say 1.2 million square kilometres, that's quite meaningless, but I think most of us can't really grasp those sorts of numbers. But we're talking about 1/6 of Australia, and Australia's a damn big continent, so it's a huge area we're covering.
When you look at all the key things that affect the health of rivers, flow diversions, flow regulation, pollution, and intensive urbanisation, all of those things are absent from this basin. So in that sense, this is one of the catchments in Australia, indeed the world, that has very, very low impact in that regard.
So I think we have managed to create something more than the geographer's basin. We've created a sense of understanding about a part of Australia, a sense of identity for that part of Australia, and more of a sense of belonging for people here, that they are a part of this very unique part of the world.
In that sort of paradox of being in a desert, really, and then having this sort of oasis of biology, but also it's that sort of contrast of water and desert. And when you look at water birds, they just provide such a diversity of life on these systems.
Yeah, I think I guess what makes them sensitive is that people regard these big flood events as being an incredible waste of water. And of course, when you look at the way that these kinds of systems are likely to work, it's the big pulses of water that are going to create enough production that's ultimately going to sustain all the populations during the periods when, if you refer to it as a boom or bust cycle, it's the real boom periods that carry them through. So I think the threat is this perception that there's a lot of water going to waste, when indeed there's not.
The Cooper drainage, as you know, is characterised by episodic flooding and then long periods of dry, and the river channels contain a lot of large permanent waterholes, which are especially important as dryland refugia for a wide range of wildlife, including these turtles.
I think the biggest threat is that as pressure goes on for water, water resource demands grow. Places like the Murray-Darling Basin are already seen to be overdeveloped. There's certainly a lot of interest in developing water resources here and in other more northern parts of Australia. And I think the real challenge is going to be to how do you meet some of those demands in a sustainable way without degrading these systems. In the case of these kinds of systems, I think people are starting to become aware that any kind of major development is probably not going to be acceptable and not sustainable. So I think we've got to, we may have to make the choices of keeping some rivers like these ones set aside so that we don't make the mistakes that we've seen in the Murray.
Angus Emmett lives with his family on Noonbar Station, spanning the Thomson River, part of the Cooper catchment in the Lake Eyre Basin. Besides being a pastoralist, Angus Emmett is a noted natural historian and herpetologist with an extensive natural history collection of his own. He's collected for many museums and universities in Australia and overseas. He has had 4 previously undescribed species named after him.
Big sand goanna, rarest panoptes. They're beautiful big fellas. Just caught him in the laundry. So I'll let him go out in the garden in a minute. But they're fairly powerful big animals, but they're beautiful.
Angus Emmett has been involved with the Lake Eyre Basin process from the beginning and is one of the driving forces from the community level.
What we've got is really unique, and I think it's in very good condition. There's been some damage over the last 100 years, but it's not great. We still have natural flow regimes and the ecology is working basically the same as it always has. I think we have the ability now to actually have industries within the basin that complement the uniqueness and the natural part of the natural state of the system. We've already got organic beef, and I think there's a lot of future in working within the constraints of what we've got to provide clean green products for the world and maintain this really unique part of the world.
The nation's poets such as Banjo Patterson forged the essence of the Australian psyche from this kaleidoscopic landscape. A land of plenty, and a land in which the winds blow crumbling dust off the bleached bones of dreams of white pioneers and the old people who stood in their way. And still today, artists in paint and film and words tell the story of the inland rivers, building fragments of the foundation of our national identity.
At the meeting they formed a steering group, what they called the Lake Eyre Basin Steering Group, and they gave that a sunset clause. They said, okay, this is only going to be around for a couple of years, and a very distinct terms of reference, which was, let's look at the issues in the Lake Eyre Basin and let's look at future management options.
Well, it kicked off with the attempted World Heritage listing of Lake Eyre, and then the Curra cotton job was really a catalyst, I suppose, because it was a double threat.
While the cotton on the Cooper raised public awareness of the inland rivers and created a rallying point, the Lake Eyre Basin process was already well underway before that proposal came about.
The possibility of cotton on the Cooper did help push people along, but it was expecting a much greater level of maturity from people.
And that maturity saw the Lake Eyre Basin process come of age and become stronger after the dissipation of the challenges of World Heritage listing and the cotton on the Cooper.
I was employed in 1996 to work with that steering group to get some of those things happening, and embarked upon a rather ambitious consultation process across the basin, which is about 1.2 million square kilometres.
Kate Andrews drove tens of thousands of kilometres during that consultative process, living out of her swag, and she identified the issues of concern for the people of the Lake Eyre Basin and developed a series of options from which they could make a choice.
The fantastic thing about this process was, number one, I wasn't working for a government, and so that led to a lot of extra credibility in the process. Number two, there was no fait accompli. I wasn't actually coming along to people saying, we are going to set up a structure and you are going to be involved in this way.
The steering group's work was put before the stakeholders at another Birdsville meeting at the end of 1997.
And we all sat down, and the first big question was, well, do we want to do anything? Do we want to proceed? And it was a fantastic moment and very exciting when people said, yes, we do. We can actually pull this together.
In 1998, the catchment committees for the Cooper and Georgina Diamantina were put together, and the steering group metamorphosed into the Lake Eyre Basin Coordinating Group. Coordinator Kate Andrews became the first chief executive.
And at the end of the year 2000, we launched the strategies, And at the same time, the heads of agreement was signed between the Commonwealth, Queensland and South Australian governments. And that was crucial. It was a really important moment when the coordinating group was asked to be the Community Advisory Committee for the Ministerial Council under the heads of agreement, because that locked together the community and the government processes, and it gave the community direct access to the decision makers, which is something they'd asked for at in their original consultations. So by the end of 2000, it was a fully fledged process that wasn't in a vacuum operating in the middle of Australia, but was sitting within the political system as well. It had a lot of support, very broad support from community, and I think it was the first in the world.
The Lake Eyre Basin process by the end of 2000 had attracted attention from around Australia and from overseas. Ecologist Peter Cullen.
The models we're developing of communities understanding the whole basin and the whole resource, and making decisions with the well-being of the entire basin is in fact the exemplar that we're trying to develop for other basins in Australia, and is, I think, attracting international attention as a way of going forward with river basin management.
Rain falls in the Lake Eyre Basin. Heavy falls are most likely in the northern regions of the basin during the summer monsoon-influenced wet season. Rivers run. One of the first is the Todd River, through the town of Alice Springs. Weeks after the downpour, the Cooper spills across its floodplains. Thousands of square kilometres are submerged. The key essence of life, and what makes the Lake Eyre Basin different to most river systems in the world, is its boom-bust cycle, the yin and yang, the duar and yirija, the female and male, the great moieties of nature. Dry times and wet times fit hand in glove to bring balance to the landscape. This is the songline to which all nature steps.
All the plants and animals have really been able to cope with the boom and bust periods, and they've evolved. They've got strategies. I mean, you know, the breeding happens when the floods come along, and they abandon it when things go, you know, into a dry period.
Been trying floodwater here since 1963. I've seen the two big ones in White Mean history, 63 and 74. And I've been in the lead of floodwater and the whole three river systems out here. And it pokes along, normally a mile a day, but by God, this is just roaring across the floodplain with froth. It's really bubbling, and I've never seen one that fast before. As I say, I've been up in the air since 63 and I've seen nothing like it. This is called the channel country. We can survive on rain, but we can't fatten with rain. This is our fattening country. Most natural fattening country in the world, and it doesn't operate without a flood.
And throughout the system, all nature regenerates.
Well, you just hear the frogs at night time down near the river, or you see the water birds flying in formation coming to the Cooper. It's beautiful to see.
So did you get some of them?
In February 2002, the future of the Lake Eyre Basin process meets its biggest challenge to date. When Angus Emmett left Noonbar to fly to Adelaide, he was unaware he was walking into a political ambush. He and other members of the coordinating group executive were shocked to be told that the funding tap for the cross-border process was about to be turned off. On his return to Longreach, an emergency meeting was called.
Members
Members of the Lake Eyre Basin Coordinating Group made a last-ditch stand this week to ensure the survival of the community process started 7 years ago. The group met at the Qantas Museum on Monday and Tuesday in an attempt to find a way forward.
I think the process is certainly going to go ahead. There's a lot of hard work in front of us. There's going to be a lot of community involvement in making that happen in partnership with government, but yes, I feel positive that the process will be going ahead.
The meeting follows last month's announcement that both state and federal governments will cease funding arrangements to the coordinating group.
It's been hard, it's been frustrating, but it's been also, to walk out of there at lunchtime today was it was a good feeling. There's still ways to go, but we've reaffirmed our commitment to the process. We've reaffirmed our values, our underpinning value of whole of basin community-driven approach. And I think that once you have those fundamental values all reaffirmed, everyone's still saying the same thing. So let's take it on from here and let's look forward to a future prosperous basin-wide approach to management.
The big outcome is that the community-driven whole of basin approach has been reinforced very, very loudly and very, very strongly. And for it to work, that's the way it's got to be. It's got to be a whole of basin approach.
The meeting reached a unanimous decision to push for the continuation of the coordinating group. Members say any breakdown of the cross-border whole of basin nature of the community process will place Australia's unexploited inland rivers at risk.
Easter at the Emmett property, Noonbar. The big Easter moon brings some peace to Angus and his family. Life begins to regain some normality. Angus Emmett tosses the thoughts. Is the time and emotion he's putting into the Lake Eyre Basin worthwhile?
No, I haven't given up hope, Bruce. We'll still be talking with politicians and bureaucrats, and I think that they are still committed to a cross-border approach, and the community are very, very strongly behind maintaining that principle.
Part of the problem is not being able to see a clear way forward.
Well, it is still blurred, Bruce, because at the moment we still haven't got clear guidelines on how NHT Mark II is working, but we're looking at working within the state regional framework in Queensland and also working with South Australia and trying to, through that, also develop a means of continuing our cross-basin community-driven process. I think there's been so much time and passion put in by community people and government departments and politicians. I don't think that we just have to keep it going, because that's the future of natural resource management. It has to have a huge input from the communities that live in an area, and it has to be cross-basin. You can't have it cut off at state borders, because rivers run downhill, they don't stop when they get to a border.
The Finke River rises in the red sandstone upthrusts of the Western MacDonnell Ranges. Some say this river is older than time. Certainly it is the oldest river on the planet that still flows, far predating the breakup of Gondwanaland. Today the Finke is one of the desert rivers of the Lake Eyre Basin. It runs through an ancient landscape. And here, on the banks of the Finke, a modern-day drama of natural resource management is being played out. An introduced species of shade tree, the athel, after almost a century of behaving itself, has broken out in an explosion of riverine colonisation that has produced large sections of monocultures and high salinity on the banks of Central Australia's rivers, like the Finke.
Well, as you can see in here, we've got virtually an ecological desert. There's no bird nests, there's no insects, there's no spiders, no mice, nothing. The occasional rabbit will hide under it, and that's about all that's living in here.
Control is expensive and time-consuming. The threat of weeds such as athel, prickly acacia, Parkinsonia, Parthenium, they're all currently contained in subregions of the Lake Eyre Basin.
Making macro-level decisions with involvement of the entire basin is the essence of the coordinating group's importance to natural resource management crossing state borders. But the future for the Lake Eyre Basin Coordinating Group is now on the slide.
Option 1 was to stay as current as we are.
Founding CEO Kate Andrews has moved on to new challenges. The group appears to have lost its way and is now attracting criticism, lack of transparency, loss of contact with the grassroots stakeholders. The Federal Minister for Forestry and Conservation flies into Longreach on a fact-finding tour.
The Federal Minister for Forestry and Conservation, Senator Ian MacDonald, flew into Longreach today to meet with representatives of the Lake Eyre Basin Coordinating Group and catchment committees. The meeting is expected to discuss funding arrangements for the community group in the face of changes likely under the Natural Heritage Trust Mark II.
The final criteria, the final rules, you might say, for the NH2 yet haven't yet been completed. And we're looking at all aspects of how to get the best bang for our federal buck out of the NHT monies.
New funding arrangements under NHT2 are being developed by the federal government following dissatisfaction with funding distribution to small endeavours such as land care projects under NHT Mark I.
There was a belief, a feeling that NHT1, whilst it did a hell of a lot of very good things around our country, it was a bit uncoordinated.
Senator MacDonald says funding under NHT2 will flow from the federal government through state governments to large state-based regional natural resource management groups.
With NHT2 we've focused it towards regional areas, catchment areas perhaps, and in that context obviously the Lake Eyre Basin is a big catchment, it is a big region that crosses state borders. Now that may have some difficulties in the funding aspect because various of the states are going to contribute in various ways to the NHT pool of money.
While Senator MacDonald isn't prepared to rule out funding large cross-border catchment bodies such as the Lake Eyre Basin Coordinating Group directly, he says this will be difficult under NHT Mark II because of state-based funding distribution.
For science, the Lake Eyre Basin is full of unanswered questions. Scientists have found cicadas that don't sing and others that weren't supposed to sing that do. The great waterholes and the boom-bust cycle and how they all work over time are still filled with mystery. Professor Peter Cullen is one of the world's leading freshwater ecologists.
I don't think, as a scientist, I would ever say we have enough knowledge. I think we have sufficient knowledge to manage it reasonably sensibly, and one of the challenges at the moment from the science community is to package our scientific understanding in ways that the community and governments can understand. We're not always bleating for further research funds, although there's lots of things that we should do in Lake Eyre. But we understand that the water comes from the upper parts of Lake Eyre and the northern areas, and that water is generated by runoff there, and so if we do agricultural practices there that damage that amount of runoff or the quantity of it, it's going to impact downstream on the channel country, which is all of its production is driven by those flood pulses that it doesn't get much rainfall itself, but it gets productivity from the flood. And then further down we've got the actual receiving waters of Lake Eyre and the Kunji Lakes and the other systems that are again totally dependent on water that runs off in Queensland. So we've got to manage it as a system, we've learnt that much. And there's at least three different sort of areas. There's the uplands that generate the runoff, there's the channel country that benefits from the runoff, and then there's the receiving waters which give us these ecological values.
And out in the field on Kyabra Creek and the Cooper catchment, Professor Stuart Bunn continues the search for understanding with his team of researchers.
I guess the key thing we're looking at in the project is to identify how important these waterholes are as refugia, sort of havens for the aquatic biodiversity in the region. And so we're interested in not only what are the kinds of refugia and which ones are more important than others, but also to understand what are the processes that sustain those waterholes and sustain the populations of plants and animals in them. One of the big projects we have at the moment with the CRC for freshwater ecology is looking at a whole range of plants and animals as part of our overall assessment of biodiversity. So we have a big team of people working on algae, so that's the aquatic plants, the fish and invertebrates that live in there, and then there's another group working on turtles as well. Big picture stuff, I guess there's a lot more species than we've ever thought there'd be. For example, our recent work on the species of freshwater mussels in the river system has revealed there are 5 species here at least, instead of the original 1 we thought. We're finding out things on how organisms move throughout the river systems. And also, really what we're interested in too is how is biodiversity arranged among all the waterholes, and are there key waterholes in the landscape that are really important.
How many traps? Yeah. It looks heavy. We've got at least 1 in here. S83. Oh, look out. One. Do you want 6 or not?
Yeah, I'm getting it. 1 male, 1 female.
Yeah, so we catch the animals by putting traps in the water that are baited, and the traps have a breathing tube that enables the animals to get to the surface to take a breath of air. That's very important.
In the permanent waterholes of the Cooper, Professor Arthur Georges and his research team attempt to unlock the eco-secrets of the Cooper's Creek turtle.
Central Australia's the last place you'd expect to find freshwater turtles, but in fact the Cooper drainage here is home to one of the largest freshwater turtles in Australia, the Cooper Creek turtle. And it's a bit of a mystery as to how these animals, which rely upon permanent fresh water, can manage to survive in such a harsh environment as the Cooper drainage. Well, she's a very large animal. She could be 80, maybe 90 years old. They grow exceptionally slowly, only a few millimetres a year once they mature, and they feed on algae and shellfish and crayfish. We're looking at waterholes that are unimpacted by fishing, waterholes that have been protected by the landholders for decades. We're looking at the characteristics of those populations, and then we're picking other areas that are very similar in all respects, except that there's been fairly intensive fishing pressure placed on those waterholes, and we're having a look at how the turtles are responding to that fishing pressure. And the laparoscopy enables us to have a look inside the animal in a non-destructive way. We don't have to kill the animal. We can look inside and get an indication of whether it's in breeding condition or whether it's a juvenile, still a juvenile animal. So we can get estimates of the size at the onset of maturity for different populations, fished populations and protected populations.
Lake Eyre Basin is home to some of the most venomous snakes on the planet, and this in itself poses an unanswered question. Why are these snakes so venomous when their prey is made up of being small, relatively easily killed marsupials and reptiles? No one really knows, but dangerous these snakes are, like the western taipan and this mulga snake or king brown. Angus has made the study of reptiles in the Lake Eyre Basin a life's work, and he's a skillful handler of the basin's poisonous snakes.
In terms of conserving our natural heritage and our native fauna and flora, these rivers are not only important for the things that live in the water themselves, but we know that they play an essential role in the landscape. Never more so is that important in an arid part of the world like this.
While the mysteries, big and small, of the inland rivers are being unravelled by scientists, the production of cattle remains the biggest industry in the Lake Eyre Basin, along with oil and gas extraction and growing tourism as city folk learn about the nature of the basin's rivers. Cattle production in the Channel Country brings millions of dollars to the mostly corporate owners of this rich, fattening production line. And the big companies have learnt, for the best results, the natural order must be respected. So the big road trains roll, bringing cattle in to be fattened during the good seasons, and destocking and leaving the country bare during dry times.
And in these dry times, nature in the Lake Eyre Basin has a bite for the cattle producers. The other side of the coin of life-giving floods is drought. In 2002-2003, the Lake Eyre Basin is hit by the worst drought since European settlement.
Everyone on the land's struggling to survive with drying up waters and stock. And townspeople, there's not much money going into town, so everyone's being affected. It's across the spectrum. It's keeping pretty busy because Karen and I are here on our own now, and we've got 3 dams dry and 2 about to go dry. Cattle are really losing condition. We're losing cattle. We're pulling all the weaners off. So yeah, extremely busy. We're not getting any time to work on improvements or fencing. We're running waters and putting lick block out. Just generally keeping an eye on the stock, but by the time you get around, check all your waters, check your stock, the days are gone. So it's full on doing that and nothing else. We're losing cattle in bog. We're gradually getting the waters fenced off, but we haven't got them all fenced off yet, so we're losing stock, and it's fairly disheartening when you have to shoot cows and drag them away.
With stakeholders tied up with the day-to-day tragedy of drought, it's difficult to keep an eye on the fast-moving political ball.
But what needs to be done to ensure the survival of the Lake Eyre Basin Coordinating Group?
The Coordinating Group does have to revisualise itself, just how it's adding value to the system, what resources it needs, and then I believe that resources are available under the ministerial agreement that can be tapped once they've got a clear sense of vision. But they won't just be funded to have frequent meetings where they just have nice hand-holding sessions. They're going to have to add value to the whole process.
Robertson is releasing some details in relation to the Queensland stock group. And at the moment we've got a drought, and you wouldn't have a better time to release these maps which Stephen and his
In late July, the Peter Beattie Queensland State Government arrives in the Lake Eyre Basin with all the fanfare of a travelling circus.
The Queensland State Government Community Cabinet came to Balcaldon over the weekend, with Premier Peter Beattie highlighting the growing drought conditions throughout Western Queensland.
We've got a couple of issues with education and health that we feel are progressing quite well.
The Lake Eyre Basin Coordinating Group made a submission to Minister for Natural Resources Stephen Robertson, seeking answers on the direction of Natural Heritage Trust Mark II funding and the future of the Coordinating Group.
Things are very uncertain at the moment with the whole NHT Mark II issue and how funding is flowing through to states and how a regional strategy program is going to be structured. So yes, nothing's set in concrete at this point in time.
Stephen Robertson says he's being frustrated by the refusal of the federal government to finalise funding arrangements.
I must admit I'm getting a bit concerned about the level of that argy-bargy, and am in fact contemplating having discussions with my interstate and federal colleagues to express that concern, because we really can't leave these groups high and dry just because government bureaucrats are still engaged in discussions.
After his meeting with the Minister, Mr Emmett says he remains confused about future funding procedures.
I think we need to change the way we operate and change our structure, but we need to keep our eye on the big picture and see where we're going and work out how we're going to get there.
Stephen Robertson says he is hopeful funding to cross-border groups like the Lake Eyre Basin Coordinating Group can be maintained under NHT2.
Well, I think it can be maintained. A proposal is sitting with me now in terms of how we do that better than perhaps is currently the circumstances.
I think there is going to be funding through state governments, but I think it's very critical for the future of our natural resources across the Lake Eyre Basin to keep the big picture and keep a community process across the whole of the Lake Eyre Basin.
Community groups reliant on NHT funding for survival now have to wait for the federal and state governments to agree on their respective financial contributions to NHT Mark II.
Peter McLeod is now 18 months into his contract as Chief Executive of the Coordinating Group. He's fighting for his survival and that of the group.
Perhaps government has become a little impatient with the time that has been taking and likes to see outcomes in a very short period of time, and it usually relates to funding cycles, which has been well demonstrated in natural resource management, just isn't achievable. In fact, there's been quite a criticism of earlier programs with the Natural Heritage Trust.
It can be too easy sometimes to blame other sources or to say that this is a threat to us. I think those things can be managed, particularly if you have good relationships with all levels of government, if you are managing to perform, if you're producing outcomes, if you have good support from not just community but from industry and all the different stakeholders. If you have that good support, then you are unlikely to be under threat, because government knows damn well that, you know, all those people out there are a part of that process and are wanting you to continue.
It begins to appear that the current management of the Coordinating Group is not meeting Kate Andrews' criteria for survival, that is, maintaining good relationships with all levels of government, perform by producing solid outcomes, and maintaining good support from the community. In August 2002, a meeting of the Lake Eyre Basin Coordinating Group was called at Moomba in South Australia.
We made the decision then to reduce the size of the coordinating group, and we also made the decision to be heavily involved with the new regional structures that the states are putting in place.
By New Year 2004, the Lake Eyre Basin Coordinating Group has been dismantled. The catchment committees and coordinating group have closed down their Longreach office. The catchment groups have been brought under the umbrella of the newly formed Regional Natural Resource Management Group, Desert Channels, Queensland.
I was asked to be an independent chair of this new group, and while half our board's made up of Lake Eyre Basin Coordinating Group people, it's really their responsibility and mine to make sure that the ideal or the value, whatever else that the coordinating group stood for, still gets done.
Peter Douglas is a former mayor of the Barcoo Shire. His property near Junda has been crippled by drought, and he's forced to earn an income contracting away from home. He says the coordinating group was sidestepped because of its own problems.
The Lake Eyre Basin is not treated as a Lake Eyre Basin anymore. It's now got a Desert Channels Natural Resource Management Committee board, whatever you like to call it, that runs the Queensland side of the Lake Eyre Basin. It's got a South Australian Interim Natural Resource Management Board. The Territory's talking about coming into the agreement actually with about 40-50,000 k's of the Georgina Diamantina catch.
The coordinating group and catchment committees are now located within the Department of Natural Resources and Mines offices in Longreach. Some members see this as a loss of perceived independence from government departments, something the coordinating group had fought for years. Angus Emmett says the state-based group no longer fully meets the visions of the Whole of Basin Coordinating Group.
The whole thrust of what we've been doing is trying to break down state borders and look at whole of catchment and whole of basin. And I believe that this new regional structure is actually a backward step with regard to that. I think it's absolutely critical from a natural resource management point of view that we, all over Australia and all over the world, we need to look at whole of catch and whole of basin, because water flows downhill. It's that simple, and all the other natural resource issues are connected to that.
I don't think it was a straight set out to get Lake Eyre Basin Coordinating Group blown apart. I think it was more of a funding operation, and they wanted more tangible results. Whether Lake Eyre Basin was going to give them or not, I think they just got brushed aside and didn't pick up the baton when it was held out to them. They didn't listen to the catchment committees. Once you don't do that, once you don't listen to the normal everyday pastoralist, townie, council worker, you name it, everyone that lives in the basin or the region has got a right to have his 2 bob's worth on natural resource management.
And by 2004, nature's great wheel has turned again, and the Emmett's property has seen good rain. Cattle that were dying a little over a year ago are now strong and in good condition. And it's mustering time. Angus has not entirely given up hope for the Lake Eyre Basin Coordinating Group.
It's not dead at this point in time. It's still an incorporated identity, and it still has an executive, but exactly what the future is at this point in time is hard to guess.
As the chair of the Community Advisory Committee to the Ministerial Forum under the Lake Eyre Basin Agreement, Angus continues to push for a whole-of-basin approach to natural resource management.
I think it's very important for the wider Australia community and also the world community to actually be aware of what's going on and make long-term strategic management decisions rather than just let it flow on and let things happen and then realise 20 years down the track, oh, we shouldn't have done that.
The Lake Eyre Basin process, so strong in the 90s, has, for whatever reason, stumbled. In 2004, the Queensland Department of Primary Industries is actively promoting diversification into irrigation in Western Queensland. And a new irrigation project has been approved and is underway on the Thomson River.
This area traditionally has had no intensive agriculture. It's just been broadacre grazing, and as such it's in very, very good shape. There's always going to be people that wish to try and approach this a different way, and there's going to be people that wish to go into more intensive agriculture. And the big danger of that is the small incremental effect will gradually creep up on us, and before we know it, the whole system's going to be overcommitted, and the water that's so crucial, the actual water component of that will be removed, and it can lead to the total breakdown of the system over a period of time.
The community of the Lake Eyre Basin set out to create an environment that was inclusive and ensured the sustainability, economic and environmental, of the entire basin. This came to mean the exclusion of marginal profit-driven development ventures such as medium and large-scale irrigation. But a federal government rationalisation of funding processes has seen state borders break down the whole-of-basin approach enshrined in the Lake Eyre Basin process. So it's now up to individuals and catchment committees to maintain cross-border communications, but there are no guaranteed processes to maintain this approach, and the threat of state tribalism in the future is real. Lake Eyre Basin stakeholders' worst fears, identified only 2 and 3 years ago, seem to have come to pass. The way is once more open for the slow creep of economic need to take water from these largely unprotected systems.
As the rivers die in other areas, irrigation development want to come west where it hasn't been touched. You know, you just can't get it through to governments, bureaucrats that just can't take any water out of these systems. If irrigation gets into this river, it's only a matter of time before chemicals get down the river, but it won't be too much worry about them getting down the river because there won't be any water go past Windora except once every 10 years if we're lucky.
And it's once again possible that the rivers that run through the nation's dusty interior could themselves turn to rivers of dust.
It's so easy, in fact, to kill a river off. You can do it in 10 years if you regulate it, put dams in, abstract water.
Rivers are dying all over the world, and it doesn't take big changes, particularly in the amount of water going in and when it goes into the river systems, to change totally the ecology and the biology of these systems.
No matter how much we spar over different issues, we can all respect each other because we understand that each one of us is connected to this country. And that's what makes it worthwhile going through this process and having the fights that we have and the tussles and also the wins that we have. We do that because of what we all love, and that's important. Yep.
And if we mess this system up, and if we mess systems like this, like the Cooper, like the Paru, like the Bulu, we really are throwing away our heritage for future generations. I think that's about all I can do.